On this week's episode of Scaffolds, I talked to Anna Wunsch about Apple viruses. Kerik gives us an update on Apple Blotch and Anna, and Anna gives us our state of the state update on degree day accumulation and trap captures. Okay, so today I'm here with Anna Wunsch. Anna did a master's degree with Dr. Marc Fuchs and is now working as a research support specialist in his lab. And today we're going to talk about viruses in Apple. So welcome, Anna.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm super excited to learn more about viruses in Apple. So when you were doing this work, what were the specific questions you were looking to answer?
Yeah, so viruses in apples can tend to be a little bit poorly understood. I know when we think about apple diseases, the main players, of course, are bacterial and fungal, like fire blight and apple scab, but viruses infect apples as well. And the infections they cause can be a little less obvious. So the big players in the apple virus world, the most prevalent viruses, tend to cause latent infections, meaning that they don't cause obvious symptoms on most of the commercial cultivars that are being grown today. So that means that you could walk out into your orchard and trees may be infected, but you wouldn't be able to tell by looking at them.
When you were looking for viruses, were you targeting any certain varieties or any certain stage of apples? And do we have any idea how the viruses are getting into the apples?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, just to back up, viruses of apples, there are a few really prevalent ones that are kind of globally distributed. So we have them really prevalently in New York. And those, particularly the three that are most prevalent, I tend to refer to as the big three. Those are apple stem pitting virus, ASPV, apple chlorotic leaf spot virus, or ACLSV, and apple stem grooving virus, or ASGV. And what's interesting about these viruses is that they are all known only to be graft transmissible, which means that they don't have any insect vectors that are transmitting them from one plant to another. They're also not mechanically transmitted. These are just being transmitted from one tree to another through grafting or budding or other vegetative propagation methods. So as trees and planting material have been distributed across the globe over the past, 100, 200 years, those viruses in that material have been transported around the globe as well. And so now a lot of them can be found everywhere that apples are grown. So once a tree is infected, that virus can be found throughout all of its tissues, from the roots, the leaves, and we found even the fruits, including the peel and the flesh and even the seeds.
So I guess my main question is, okay, so there's these viruses and they may be in the plant material, but what are the symptoms to look out for? I know you said they're not super obvious, but are there any characteristic symptoms of any of those big three that would be worth looking out for?
So unfortunately, no, the big three on the commercial cultivars that most people are growing won't cause any noticeable symptoms. And so really the way that these infections manifest are a little bit more subtler. So this would be like smaller decreases in productivity and yield over an orchard's lifespan. So unless you have an adjacent block of the same scion or rootstock of the same age that's uninfected, you wouldn't have a good reference to compare that yield. But the way that in a lab, scientists are able to determine whether a tree or other planting material is infected is either through a laboratory test or through biological indexing on certain apple species or cultivars do show obvious symptoms. So, for example, there's a crab apple species that is often used as an indicator species to which planting material can be grafted, and that will show characteristic symptoms.
So what about trying to avoid planting trees with viruses? Are there any good strategies for New York growers to avoid planting trees with viruses?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned, because the source of viruses in apple and pear trees is almost exclusively from infected planting material, that's infected rootstocks or infected scions, the most important management strategy is to avoid infected material in the first place. So, sourcing certified material when possible, and always sourcing material from a reputable nursery. And then the good news is that because viruses of apple and pear are for the most part not transmitted by insect vectors, they're not going to spread within an orchard if they are there. So in terms of a certification program, New York Department of Ag and Markets does offer a virus-tested plant material certification program, both for grape and for apple. And what that means is this program is nursery focused. So nurseries will bring in virus-tested clean budwood or scion and rootstock material from sources that are part of the National Clean Plant Network. And these are like the cleanest of the clean. A lot of this material, it originates from tissue culture material. And then this material is bulked up by nurseries, and those material in those increased blocks is tested on a rolling basis to ensure it's virus negative. And that material can be available through nurseries, though at this point, the number of nurseries participating in the Apple certification program is pretty small.
Is there any incentive to get more nurseries to participate, or is there some reason why they aren't?
Yes, we would love to have more nurseries participating in this program. There was a more extensive certification program in New York a few decades ago, but that petered out. And now we're sort of in a ramp up stage trying to get more nurseries to participate. I think many growers have, gone decades without having access to certified material and now maybe don't see a reason to go out of their way to look for certified material because they've become used to growing material that hasn't been able to be certified. But I think as more nurseries participate, there will be more access for growers to get access to this certified material, and I'm hoping it will catch on because that's really our only management strategy for eliminating viruses from orchards.
So I have one last question. Do you think now that we are growing everything high density, do you think that that has an impact on the effect of these viruses compared to on standard sized trees?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot that we don't understand yet about high density plantings, and especially that there are a lot of scion and rootstock combinations being planted right now that maybe haven't been tested really extensively. And we don't know a lot about how individual latent viruses or combinations and co-infections of those viruses might impact those trees. So, for example, we know that some cultivars are more sensitive to viruses than others or particular viruses, but we don't know sometimes how like a combination of those viruses might impact a new scion cultivar and rootstock combination. And we also know that in high density orchards, these trees tend to be just under a lot more stress generally because they're packed together, they're competing more for water and nutrients, and they're often pushed to crop, pretty early in their lifespan.
Okay, this is all very fascinating. So I'm hoping growers listening to this will consider getting clean plant material, especially because it's a good long-term investment. So thank you so much for joining us today, Anna.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
All right, it's another cold, somewhat rainy off and on weekend coming to you with scaffolds and our weekly disease update. So, giving us an overview of what I've noticed in the season thus far for the middle of the state, with all that early rain and continual rain through most of May and a little bit into June. We're seeing a pretty high incidence of apple scab, nothing like I've seen in 7 or 8 years. Scab is incredibly high, and I'm seeing a lot of fuzzy scab lesions on young developing fruit, about 30 to 50 millimeters in width or less, and they are covered in fuzzy gray lesions. And it's on all treatments, so all of that rain in our sort of research orchards should keep you on the lookout for some apple scab at this time. And it just seemed to show up rather quickly. One of the other things that I've seen a lot with, probably also from the rain, not the direct rain, but the high humidity that sort of is kept around during the sort of overcast days and cool weather, is apple powdery mildew on the susceptible varieties. I have Ida Red that have more powdery mildew blight than they do fire blight. It's one of the few times I've actually seen any fungal disease outcompete fire blight. That and a couple other varieties that get a lot of powdery mildew have completely blighted terminals. At first, I thought it was fire blight, and then I looked closely at it, and it's even more blighted than some of the standard pictures that one might see of a blighted terminal. All that being said, this really nice cold weather that we're having post bloom combined with a cool bloom has made it a banner year for hopefully managing fire blight. We're not seeing a lot in my heavy inoculated trials on the checks, and most products are showing a high level of efficacy under these cool conditions. The blighted shoots just can't develop as much as they'd like. We see a few things on certain checks more so than others, but for the most part, it's been a pretty good year in our heavy inoculum trial blocks as well. Sometimes they have to compete with apple powdery mildew, and then they're shut down, but not on Gala. Fire, it just seems to get a lot of scab. So scab high, powdery mildew high from the humidity, from the overcast weather, cool temperatures, and rainfall, interspersed every now and then with some nice hot, dry weather, just long enough for it to do its job, and low fire blight because of the cool bloom and cool close bloom. And we're first starting to see our first apple blotch or Marsanina leaf blotch symptoms as well. And with that, I'm going to bring into talking about the summer foliar diseases. Apple blotch used to be known as Marsanina leaf blight or leaf blotch. It now has been renamed as apple blotch, and it's been that way for a couple of years now. But the things that we'll be talking about today are the glomerella leaf spot, which might occur in lower areas of Hudson Valley, the apple blotch or Marsanina, the various frog eye leaf spots, and the alternaria spots. You can kind of tell apple blotch apart from the glomerella blotch. The apple blotch is more blotchy, like someone took a brush with ink and blotched it on a highly absorbent paper or tissue of some sort. And it will sort of move out in an ink blotch looking pattern and is filled in the center with sort of a dry brown area and these little tiny pepper specks that are the actual fruiting bodies. Now, by comparison, glomerella leaf spot itself will be more defined by the veins. It does cross them, but not in the same blotchy sense as the sort of apple blotch that you might see in that case. And sometimes it can lead to more concentric patterns in the dead brown tissues in the lesion centers. Now, both of these things can cause early defoliation in trees, and it can be quite devastating if they go unmatched. If we get a lot of rain and warm weather towards the end of the season, I've seen these things really take off. How have we kept them in control for so long? It's usually single-site fungicides used for apple scab, and a little bit later we push this, the better we are at getting rid of that Marsanina apple blotch. The reason it's been renamed is because the pathogen's name has changed. It's no longer Marsanina. It's not the pathogen anymore. It's diplocarpin. So in that particular instance, that's why the name is sort of moving to apple blotch, just in case you're wondering, a little bit of trivia there. So where are these problems most? It's really bad in organic operations where they can't get their single-site fungicides, or if you've gone to a program where you're just like, yeah, I'm just going to cover with a lot of multi-site protectants. These just don't really do the job. What does do the job are the single-site fungicides, the QOIs, DMIs, and the SDHIs. 11, group 11s, group 7 SDHIs, and group 3 DMIs. Probably a high level of control. And fortunately, these things haven't been the target of all of our uses. So we're probably fairly sensitive to these, or they're heavily managed in orchards where even the apple scab has shifted towards resistance. And how do we beat this stuff? Some of the best options are going to be sanitation in the early fall. Summer cover applications and cultivars seem to be really important. I think summer covers will be more important if you start getting more apple, Marsanina blight type situations right there. Particularly in Western New York, we've seen severe defoliation in trees with golden parents. The very different things that we've seen in terms of cultivars shortly. If they don't receive single-site fungicides from first to third cover, things get pretty devastating. I've seen examples of single-site fungicides in the group 7. Their trees look fantastic with just 2 applications, once at first, once at second cover. Meanwhile, a full protective program of Captan and Prophyte over the summer has led to defoliation in early September, which is not necessarily good for the fruit. And now we're starting to see fruit symptoms as well in really heavy disease pressure years. We do notice that the varieties are very differentially impacted. The Macintosh types do not seem to get the apple blotch as bad as the Goldens and the Golden Parents. And I've seen it in Evercrisp and some Honeycrisp and things like that. Anything that tends to get the summer diseases more heavily or the summer fruit rots, I'm seeing a lot of these scenarios. And it looks like, again, that just as first and second cover are really good and getting you through the season and making sure your tree doesn't defoliate in early September compared to the full protectant programs as well. And we've done some studies previous year and more 2 years ago. And then last year that I showed at the Eastern New York Fruit School, we're doing it on our Empire Jonah Golds. The Empire is fantastic. It doesn't get the apple blotch to any appreciable extent, while the Jonah Gold gets decimated by powdery mildew, apple blotch, and all the summer diseases, really widely spaced plots. And then we really started focusing our efforts looking at the later season, starting at 1st to 8th cover, 100 gallons an acre, even though these trees can definitely gobble up more water. If I'm going around with a backpack, it's not that challenging. And we're sort of considering our sort of pantheon of single site fungicides and the group 3s, Litsevia, Inspire Super, Provia, and with our group 7s, Flint Extra as our 11, and Maravon, our 7-11 combo, if you will. And then we've been alternating these with biologicals or protectant standards. Some of the types of things you could see, we were measuring percent defoliation and just incidence on any leaf or fruit at harvest. And one of the things I have noticed is that the blotch can look a little different depending on the different cultivars. Sometimes Gala can look a little more inky. Sometimes our Jonah Golds can look a little more speckly. It really just depends, but you want to see those sort of blotchy lesions that are sort of brown and spreading and sort of like snowflake-esque green-ish sort of spread from the outer margins of them, if you will. That kind of has sort of a spider webby type blotch, sort of ink running through like rice paper or very fine like toilet paper blotching, that type of stuff. Fruit symptoms can vary. You can see little tiny fruiting bodies forming in those as well at harvest. So one of the things that we found in last year's study, it's kind of interesting. We looked at percent defoliation, and then we looked at even apple blotch symptoms on fruit. Our untreated, we focused on the Jonah Gold since they had highest levels of apple blotch. We're talking about 60% defoliation early on in September, and incidence on fruit outweighing apple scab or anything else whatsoever, approaching almost 75 or 80. It's almost as we've never seen disease pressure this high except in apple scab 10 years ago, if you will. So this wet late season, dry early season is a scenario that which favors apple blotch. What's our season? Our season was wet early, and hopefully maybe it'll be dry late season. We won't see the blotch, and everyone will be happy and well off. And we tried a couple of different things. We left things untreated. We did things with no single site fungicides early on with NEWA, no single site fungicides later using NEWA timing, and no single site fungicides later in the covers with sort of a RimPro program early timing as well. And these are sort of things that are stopping at first or second cover and just letting the rest of the season go with just protectants. And then generally you can see or understand with those is that they end up becoming higher in terms of defoliation and for fruit blotch symptoms. The case can approach as much as 40% of all the fruit being gross and blotched out, and almost 40 to 50% defoliation. That's when things turn off a little too early. And then we looked at a pantheon of different programs that got 4 single site fungicide applications, focusing on second and third cover, and then again at 4th and 8th, some at second, 4th, and then 6 and 8, and then just 2 and 3, and then just 1 at 2 in terms of having these single sites out there. And it really looks like that second and third cover in this particular year were really, really important and sort of taking care of things. And the less or lower incidences of infections on fruit and the lowest defoliation we tend to observe. There's a little bit of variability, and we're going to continue to investigate the timing and sort of options with the materials. In this particular season in 2024, those trials are already off and underway as we are into about 3rd or 4th cover now. And who knows, maybe I'll be talking about them in a winter meeting somewhere. So in sort of summary, with our apple blotch, our Marsanina, we're looking at single site fungicides sort of in rotation in these sort of late season programs, Sevia, Inspire Super, Provia, Flint Extra, Maravon. The early covers do seem to be important over on. And I really think in order to really do a great job, you're going to need an extra one, maybe around 3rd or 4th. Once it seems like we go beyond 4th cover, we're not getting as much apple blotch control. I mean, it might be good for your fruit rots, but then I think I would maybe stop around 3rd or 4th, depending on how early the season is. This season's really early. So, almost a month earlier than others for at least the middle of the state. So I'd be a little concerned and maybe with putting it out to 4th. We're going to see what this year's data says. And then, of course, I still think 3 applications after petal fall, maybe up to fifth cover. Depends on really how the weather and how wet it's going to be. If it turns out to be a hot, dry season, probably won't need to worry about it anymore. And then you can come in and save the remaining single-site fungicides for just harvest. We noticed that sort of rotating in the biologicals or Captan, a lot of the noise between the different programs as I was either doing Captan or biologicals in different areas. And those aren't going to be as helpful. But when I had very late application of Mancozeb and one of the lowest incidences of Apple Blotch programs, when I had rotated one of those in there, prior to that 72-day line, I noticed that the Apple Blotch was probably lowest in that treatment and more consistently low. So Mancozeb might be helpful, but we really can't use it that late in the season. And then again, watch the varieties. You'll really see which ones get it pretty bad. It may not be as possible, or the trick or the challenge will be managing it with biologicals, figuring out how to use Captan. May not be Captan's our best summer material in the future. We'll have to wait and see how this all sort of plays out. Next time, I'll talk a little bit about some of our summer disease trials, the later ones, and what are some of the later summer disease considerations. Late bitter rot, fly speck sooty blotch, maybe some black rot, and we'll talk about those diseases and some of the work we did as well. All right, see you next week.
And now for the state of the state, your weekly roundup of phenology and degree day accumulations from major fruit production regions of the state. I'm Anna Wallace with the New York State IPM program at Cornell, and as usual, the information I'll be sharing has been aggregated from the regional specialists around the state. Over the past week, and right now, we're moving through a little bit of a cooler trend across most of the state, but forecasts predict that we will be moving out of that pretty soon. We've had cooler temperatures with highs only in the 60s at the end of last week and over the weekend. It's also been wetter with as much as 1.5 inches of rain recorded mostly at the end of last week and up to 1 inch of rain in some locations on Sunday. Although that's been pretty site-specific, and NEWA stations are reporting pretty different accumulations depending on location. The NOAA Climate Prediction Center 6 to 10 and 8 to 14-day outlooks are predicting a big change back to much warmer and slightly drier than average conditions. So pay attention to irrigation, especially for young high-density trees over the next couple of weeks. Looking at phenology across the state now, we continue to be well ahead of the degree day averages, the 15 and 30-year averages across the state, again, because of the early spring and warm trend earlier in the season, despite the cool weather last week. Now that the thinning window is finished, where return bloom sprays are going on, we're thinking about that at this time. In the Hudson Valley, apples are continuing to size in many locations. We're looking at 30 or more millimeters in diameter, of course, depending on variety, location, and the thinning that was done. Cherries are starting to color really nicely, particularly in earlier varieties. And peaches and nectarines are continuing to size and color. Strawberry harvest, looking at small fruits, is in full swing, so that is continuing at this time. In Western New York, in the Lake Ontario, and similarly in the Capital Region, we're just slightly behind that. Fruit is also beyond 30 millimeters in many locations. And in the Champlain Valley, again, just a little bit behind, and approaching 20 millimeters or more in many locations. Now looking at upcoming pest events. Plum curculio continues to be active in unmanaged areas. We're seeing feeding on fruitlets that can sometimes look like a little feeding mark surrounded by a red halo. Across the state, we've passed the period of this insect moving into orchards. Usually that happens from petal fall until approximately 308 degree days base 50 after petal fall. And so we've passed that across the state. Oriental fruit moth, OFM flight, is ending or continuing to taper. Codling moth flight continues. We have a similar biofix for the Hudson Valley as well as Geneva and some locations in Western New York. For most of those places, it was approximately the week of May 13th, and in the Champlain Valley, a week about after that. So this insect, we would typically target the larvae with our first insecticide application at approximately 200 to 250 degree days base 50 since the biofix. Right now, early this week in the Hudson Valley and Western New York, we're at approximately 400 to 500 degree days since that biofix. The second application targeting larvae should go on at about 10 to 14 days after that first application. And again, the Champlain Valley is just about a week behind that. Oblique-banded leaf roller trap captures continue in many locations this week. This is the second week of trap captures or sustained trap capture at the Hudson Valley Research Lab this week. In earlier locations, we've had earlier trap captures.
This insect, you should monitor growing terminals at about 600 to 700 degree days base 43 after the biofix. And you can see if there is larval activity in those growing terminals and use that to determine whether you should make an insecticide application targeting this insect. In orchards with a history of really severe or heavy pressure and infestation, an insecticide can go on targeting young larvae, and that's typically at 350 degree days base 43 after that biofix, followed up with a second spray 10 to 14 days later. I also want to mention apple maggot. It feels a little bit early. Usually we use the guidance of putting traps into the orchard at the beginning of July in many places in the state. But everything this year seems to be a little bit early, and so we're starting to put our apple maggot sticky coated red plastic spheres in the orchard this week. Also, in other parts of the Northeast, we've had reports of apple maggot trap captures as early as mid-June over the past couple of years. So it's a good idea to be thinking about getting your traps ready for apple maggot at this time. We've continued to see aphid activity, both green and red apple aphid. We see leaf curling and feeding on terminals. Rosy apple aphid can turn the leaves sort of pink and very easy to spot, so that's a good thing to be looking for. Woolly apple aphid continues to be active. This is pretty location dependent, but we're seeing the wool and aphids active on both old pruning cuts as well as moving to the axils of the leaves at this point. And we're seeing them pretty active on root suckers, so you can be looking at all those locations. We've had more reports of leafhopper and mullein plant bugs across western New York and the Hudson Valley this week, so be looking out for those insects. We've continued to see some sawfly damage, which can look like a circular sort of scar going around the fruit, but it can also look like feeding and very wet frass from small fruitlets, which can be very easily confused with internal lep feeding. So be looking for those insects. It's a little bit early to be seeing codling moth damage at this point, so it's unlikely that that would be the cause of any internal fruit feeding, but you can look for the insects to be able to determine what is causing it. San Jose scale crawlers should be emerging around this time, so if you are monitoring for this insect using double-sided sticky tape wrapped around the branch of a tree near an active infestation, you should be seeing those crawlers now. Mite activity, both European red mite and two-spotted spider mite, we expect to be taking place at this time. Especially with the very warm, dry, and potentially dusty conditions, we can see these populations exacerbated. So it's a good idea to be monitoring for this insect. During the month of June, we use a threshold of 2.5 mites per leaf, which means you'll take a sequential sample starting with 20 leaves. And if 2.5 mites are present on a leaf, it's called positive. So you'll do that for each of the leaves and then determine how many leaves were positive for mite presence. And next, you'll use the chart in the Cornell guidelines to determine whether you're above or below threshold for some kind of management. And so that would be a miticide to treat for European red mite or two-spotted spider mite. Apple leaf curling midge is a somewhat new insect in many places throughout the state. We've seen this insect for a couple of weeks now, both in western New York and in the Champlain Valley in particular. It starts with really tightly curled, sort of hardened leaves. And if you uncurl them, you can see the nymphs that turn bright orange before they pupate and drop to the ground. So you can be monitoring for that insect now. Dogwood borer, we have detected some borers and clear-winged moths flying in a few locations throughout the state. It's important to get a good identification on this insect. Dogwood borer can be very similar to peach tree and lesser peach tree borer, so make sure you're looking very carefully for identifying those clear-winged moths. Moving into some diseases, we're continuing to get reports of fire blight strikes across the state, so be scouting for those. Mostly blossom blight, but soon to be shoot blight strikes showing up in orchards where it might have slipped through. Primary scab season is over at this point, but we are detecting abundant lesions in unmanaged blocks, and in a few managed blocks, we've seen a couple of breakthrough infections occur. So make sure you stay vigilant so you can stay on top of fungicide programs for that. Typically, you'd be looking for those olive green to darker brown sort of fuzzy lesions as they first appear, and then they can become sort of sheet scab, which looks a little bit like black sooty mold covering on a whole leaf surface. Powdery mildew continues to be pretty prevalent in most of the state. We expect that to continue with the really warm, dry conditions. More reports of rusts throughout the state is also taking place, so we're seeing those bright orange lesions on leaves. And as we move into the summer months, we're starting to think more about the summer diseases. So that includes the sooty blotch and fly speck complex, as well as summer fruit rots. And so with the early spring and the really wet conditions, we expect that there's a lot of inoculum out there that could potentially cause infections. And so it's going to be important to stay on top of your fungicide program. Thinking about cherries and berries, we continue to have spotted-winged Drosophila trap captures in many parts of the state. First and sustained trap captures have been reported in many locations in the Hudson Valley and now in western New York and the Capital Region. This is the third week in a row that we've captured spotted-winged Drosophila in both Albany and Dutchess counties in the Hudson Valley and Capital Region, as well as Suffolk County on Long Island. Last week, we had first trap captures reported in Clinton, Columbia, Schuyler, Washington, and Ontario counties. And early this week, we have reports of first trap captures in Wayne, Delaware, and Tompkins County. This is a little bit earlier than usual, but not unexpected given the early wet spring conditions. Predominantly low numbers have been reported to this point, both on red sticky traps and in jar traps, but the populations can escalate really quickly after first trap captures, especially under humid, warm conditions. We have posted the quick guide for insecticides updated for 2024 on the Cornell Fruit Resources page. And it's important to be rotating your chemistries to maintain resistance management, especially for this insect that has so many generations within one season. To stay on top of the latest updates, we encourage you to subscribe to our new blog, the Berry Pest Monitoring Network, for berry growers as well as other fruit growers, such as cherry growers, that would like to continue to get spotted-winged Drosophila updates. To do this, you should go to the new blog, which is included in the show notes. Click on subscribe, which is on the right side of the page, and then you'll get another email, and you'll need to confirm your email. For the duration of the 2024 season, we'll continue to post updates about spotted-winged Drosophila on both blogs, both the Spotted-winged Drosophila blog and the Berry Pest Monitoring Network blog. But we encourage everyone to move over to the new blog because that's where the most up-to-date information will be in the future. Again, we're doing that for a couple of reasons. The first is that we are monitoring additional pests in berries. So if you want updates on those pests, you can see that on the blog. In addition, we're reporting more regionally to account for microclimates throughout the state rather than at the county level. And it's making it a little bit easier for us to manage on the back end, which hopefully you won't see at all, but it can make it more efficient for us to serve the industry. And now here are the current degree days in the major fruit-producing regions of the state. Throughout the season, we're continuing to align this with information previously done by Art and Yellow related to Macintosh phenology and degree days base 43 Fahrenheit. As of Monday, June 10th, Geneva was at 1,191 degree days, base 43. Highland, 1,282. Clifton Park, 1,156. Peru, 1,002. Medina, 1,172. Appleton North, 1,043. Fairville, 1,113, and Williamson, 1,116. The degree days and upcoming pest events from Table 714 in the Cornell Guidelines are also posted in the show notes. One final announcement, we have a second virtual Orchard IPM Scout Training coming up on Tuesday, June 25th, and this is a post-bloom follow-up to the first virtual Orchard IPM Scout Training that we held in April. We'll be broadcasting again from orchards live in our regions across New York State, going over a few insect pests and disease identification in the field, things that you can be looking for at this time in the season. So feel free to join us for that. There is a registration link in the show notes, and that information will be shared in regional newsletters. If you missed the first one, the recording is on the New York State IPM YouTube website, and you can watch that as well. Thanks, and that's all until next week.